All right. Welcome, everyone. Go ahead and get started here. We're about 3 minutes past 2. So hi, everybody, and thank you all for joining this Learning and Growing 2021 presentation, making sure the students learn before they take the exam and principles of micro. My name is Ryan Hannafin, and I am a member of the marketing team here at Hawks Learning. Our presenter today is Gabriel Martinez from Ave Maria University. Gabriel Martinez is Associate Professor of Economics and Director of Online Education at Ave Maria University in Florida. She joined in 2002. He earned his bachelor's from the University of South Carolina, an MA and PhD in economics from the University of Notre Dame, and an online master's in educational technology leadership from George Washington University. Most of his research is on topics of university education and financial crises. An American and Ecuadorian citizen, he is married and has 6 children. We will have a live Q&A session with Professor Martinez today, so please enter any questions into the Q&A as we go, and we will get to them after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent to all attendees when the video is processed and ready for distribution in the next week or so. So with that, I will hand it over to Professor Martinez.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Just to make sure you can see my screen.
Looks good to me.
Are you able to see? Oh, very good. So thank you, everybody, for coming to this presentation. Like many of you, I want to make sure that my students actually learn before I test them. The whole point of testing is to see if they learned, and I want to make sure that they do. Perhaps one of the most frustrating things is when a student comes out of a test that you really put a lot of thought into, and you believe you've been teaching them, and they come out and say, you know what, I felt totally unprepared for that test, right? I thought I was prepared, but I turned out to be totally unprepared. I think I did really well when in fact I did really poorly. If the test is supposed to be fair, right? That there's no point of tricking students or making the students really not testing their knowledge. I mean, the typical complaint that test doesn't really reflect what I know. Well, something's off if the students can make that kind of complaint. So this is the results of a class that I taught here at Ave Maria University in the last few years. So you have 181 students there taking microeconomics. I teach economics here. I teach macroeconomics, microeconomic statistics. So here's my microeconomics. This is my classes and other people's classes. And so basically what I did, and I'm going to give you the details a little bit later. What I did is I predicted their grades on the basis of their GPA, their previous classes that they had taken and things like that, and then compare that against what the grade that they actually got, right? So what you can see here is that if you were predicted to get an A and A minus, you probably did very well. If you predicted to be in the B range, you probably did okay, but even there was some range. And if you were in the third of the students, so this is dividing into thirds, if you're in the third of the students that were predicted to get somewhere between a C plus and an F, your grades were really all over the place. So what I want to know is how can I improve these people's grades, and what explains this variance? Okay, what explains this variance, this spread? May very well be study habits, right? Maybe some people like to work ahead and like to be preparing over time, and some people like to cram the night before. Maybe some people believe that their job is to sit in the classroom and receive the information from the teacher. And like I'm doing to you right now, I'm just giving you the information, versus being actively involved, right? Maybe some people just listen to it and believe that they've learned it before, rather than actually checking whether they've learned it, right? So the hypothesis would be that a lot of the work that I'm going to show you that I did for this class may very well be totally unnecessary, because it basically just replicates what students do anyway. And for other people, may very well be beneficial because it'll help them direct their efforts better. But if I'm trying to make sure that you go this particular way, and trying to make you do this particular kind of work, and you're not willing to do it, then it might be revelatory. I mean, it's not that the test was unfair, it's not that the teacher was mean, it's simply that I didn't know what I was talking about, and that's why I got a bad grade. So the expectation then, if you think about what these consequences would be, is that for some people, this that both the average grade should increase and that the spread of the grade should increase. Many students follow, as we know, unfortunately, even here at Ave Maria University, in every school, there's people who want to follow a coast and cram strategy. Or like my dean said when I was talking to him about this, you know what, no, that student doesn't follow a coast and cram strategy. He follows a coast and not cram strategy. So many people come unprepared, right? They study, maybe they spend a great deal of time and effort studying the wrong things, right? Maybe they study a lot the night before, take the test, and then forget it really quickly, right? A lot of them are going to be overconfident, right? A lot of them will be missing building blocks and not even know that they've missed the building blocks, and they're still going to be move on. Maybe they just didn't go to that class that day. Maybe they weren't paying attention. They were thinking about lunch or something else, or they were distracted in some way and missed that important concept, right? So what I did to some degree reflects a bit of the educational psychology literature. Even though I'm an economist, I got interested into this, and so there's some educational psychology literature in that if you space out what you learn, right? And sometimes could be just a couple of weeks, over several days, over a couple of weeks, over months, over years, right? If you've been looking at this particular topic every August, right? Eventually the effort of having forgotten and relearning actually helps you learn better than if you had crammed all of that learning in just a few days, right? So the hypothesis is that if you space out this learning, you're going to forget some of it, and having to relearn it makes the learning deeper, right? And also the fact is that if you're trying to learn everything 9 hours before the test and you spend 7 hours studying 9 hours before the test, you probably not sleep very well. It's quite possible that the sleep itself does something neurological that is beneficial, right? And then there's all the psychological literature on self-testing. The idea is that I'm going to ask you to take this practice exam many times. We're recording a minimum performance, and then you're able to compare how you did in this practice exam against the real exam, right? It could very well be that the feedback is me telling you word from in particular, look, you got this wrong, you need to make this line in this other way, something like that. It may very well be that the peers are giving the feedback, or maybe that you figure out what you did wrong. You got question 5 wrong. Why is it wrong compared against the book? Oh, I see. This is how it's different. It maybe it will be you learn quite a bit more that way, right? Should you give the right answer? Students are constantly saying, you know what, I can't learn until you tell me what the right answer is. Well, if I tell you what the right answer is, then you just know that the answer is B, or I mean, I did the work, right? The whole idea of whoever does the work does the learning. No, I want you to figure it out on your own. And the self-testing does something else that is good. It gives the students the confidence that they know they can pass the test because they've passed a previous test that is very similar in coverage, similar in form and length, similar in difficulty and grading standards, so that they've seen a very, very similar test. And I will tell you exactly what I mean by that in a little bit. And worst case scenario, if you did really badly in the practice test, you know you're not walking in with overconfidence into the real test, right? In addition, having to see it again and again and again makes you learn it better. Right? To some degree, my strategy, my structure in the class follows the ideas of mastery learning, not perfectly well, and explain you why in a second. The philosophy behind mastery learning is that the difference between a successful student, a student of high ability and a student of low ability is not intelligence, is not some kind of innate talent, is how much time it takes the low ability student to get there, right? So the high ability student might be able to get there in just a few minutes in one try. The low ability student just means that it's just going to take him longer, right? And just is going to have to follow a series of problems, but eventually they're both are going to be able to know as much as the material independently, right? So it's important for there to be formative assessments that tell the student and the teacher what has been learned and what hasn't. That there have to be correctives in the form of feedback, in the form of more reading or something like that, additional practice. while the students that pass this formative assessment do some kind of enrichment activity that is more fulfilling or something like that. And then eventually they're able to move on to the next unit, as opposed to simply saying, you know what, you did unit 1, you failed, no problem, let's move on to movie 2. That doesn't make any sense. So in my microeconomics courses in 2020, what I did is that there was a lot of self-testing. There was a great deal of self-testing. There were learning checks in every section, multiple repeatable exams. I didn't provide detailed feedback, but I did tell them, okay, this is the feedback, and put the checks right next to the reading, so it was easy for them to go back. There was a lot of spacing. Instead of saying everything is due right before the test, everything is due every single day. You're relearning this, you're practicing, and so on. And I followed some of the ideas of mastery learning, but not all of them. I didn't provide enrichment activities, and the feedback was not incredibly detailed. However, the formative assessments were right next to the material that had to be learned, so that it was easy for them to go back. Right? There was strong alignment in the goals, instructions, and the formative assessment and summative assessment. I put together the videos. I'm in the videos. I actually wrote out the reading, the textbook that they had to read. I wrote it out from a lecture notes. I put together the checks. I put together the quizzes. I put together the tests. So I knew exactly what was going on, right? So, and I'm going to be using the terminology mastery to indicate the courses that follow this idea rather than the regular courses in the university. What did I actually do? So using Canvas, what I did is to say, okay, here's lecture, collaborative reading, and check. Lecture, reading, and check. Lecture, reading, and check. So every chapter was divided up in this way, right? The students had to submit they had to submit the lecture. They had to watch the lecture before they could actually do the reading, and they had to have done both before they could do the check. They couldn't move on to unit 2 unless they hadn't done unit 1. They couldn't do unit 3 unless they had finished both unit 1. They couldn't do the test. Like we know, many of our students, they may or may not have paid a lot of attention during class. They may not have done the reading, but they show up to the test expecting they're going to do well because they're smart or whatever, because they paid for it. No. If you're going to show up to my test, you need to have done all of this work beforehand. You need to have scored at least 40 points in the 50, about 70% in the practice exam before you come in to the test. Right? These lectures were relatively easy. Videos were relatively easy quizzes. The perusal readings had to be viewed. I couldn't really have a minimum grade on that because of the way that the Canvas grading synchronization worked, but you had to at least view the reading. That you couldn't pretend that you didn't know where the book was, and you had to have a minimum score of 80% in the learning checks. And to some degree, I'm following the idea here of spacing and kind of repeated practice, because I'm going to show you, I'm showing you this, and then I'm going to show it to you in more detail, and I'm going to show it to you in more detail. So it's going to feel a little bit repetitive because I'm following the idea of spacing and repeated practice. And then they had the two practice tests, and then came the quiz, and then it was a discussion. So was this an enormous amount of work? Well, it was some work for me to put together, but it was not necessarily an enormous amount of work for the students. We're talking about every unit might have taken about I don't know, an hour and a half of work, and that means an hour and a half of work per summer, or maybe 30 to 45 minutes during the fall. So 30 to 45 minutes a day during the fall, it doesn't sound like too much, quite frankly. The summer 2020 course was entirely online. The fall 2020, well, you know what, this is 2020, so it wasn't interrupted by COVID. So that might, arguably, the fact that there was so much interruption would have pushed the grades down. So you would expect the grades to be somewhat lower because this was, 2020. What about these videos? So I use Panopto for it, and you can see if you are not familiar with Panopto, this is what they look like. There's the teacher, and there is the reading that I'm basically just going through and talking over this video, and the students could basically just follow these thumbnails. The important part was that every once in a while, every few minutes, and you can see at the 2-minute mark, at 5, 7, 10-minute mark, every few minutes, there was a quiz. There was a quiz. And the quiz basically asked a very simple question, and you had to just click on this, and here are my policies. Here are my policies. I allowed them to retake it over and over. They could see what their correct answer or the wrong answer was. So it was intended really to be easy. It was intended to make sure that they, I don't know, we're just following rather than just press play and then go to the bathroom. They actually had to be paying attention, at least at some level. So at least something, I was sure that something was sticking to their brains. Then came the reading, and this was, in many ways, this was the heart of the learning. If you're not familiar with perusal, I definitely recommend it. What you do basically is, as you're reading, you highlight things, and then you're able to make comments, right? So you're going back and forth and talking about the different things in the reading. There's all sorts of different policies. You get more points if your comments are more substantial, if they're spread out, and if you read the entire assignment, if you turn it in early, etc. I have to say that this was an enormous amount of fun to see how much they grew in learning through the reading. And then after they do the reading, they had to do these learning checks, right? Typically, we're talking about 10 objective questions, multiple choice, fill in the blank, drop down, that sort of thing, really close related to the lecture and the reading, okay? And the key here that I want to point out is the policies that I followed, okay? In order to move on, they had to score at least 80%, right? They had unlimited attempts, but what I wanted to avoid was the student who just sits there, okay, A, okay, didn't work. B, okay, didn't work. C, aha, I got it. Now, I wanted to make sure that at least there was some enforcement of time between attempts to, well, and is it possible that they were playing Fortnite between attempts? Absolutely. Is it possible they were just ignoring it? But they had at least 10 minutes in which they were given every incentive to go back to the reading, to review what was wrong, rewatch the lecture, and reread the reading, right? If some of these questions that you can see were multiple choice, others were quantitative, so I had to enter a number. Others were formula based, so that every time that they attempted this, they would get a totally different problem in a way. And basically with the idea that I want to make sure that you actually learn something, right? There has to be some gatekeeping so that you can't move on to the next unit in the chapter. You can't move on to the next chapter unless you've learned the part before. Okay, you can see here's the requirement of the 10 minutes. They were able to see what they got, whether they were wrong or right, but I wasn't telling them what the right answer was. So they needed to figure, if they got it wrong, they need to go back and figure it out. You can see that students often, sometimes they pass on the first attempt, but often they had to make many attempts, and particularly like this one here. So this student actually passes at the 4th attempt. But at this point, you know what, is going to get the 100%. So just kept going until she got the 100%. And this happened very often, that the students just, by the time that they got 80%, they were good enough at it that they could just push through and get the 100%. Then for every chapter, every couple of chapters, there was a quiz. Every 4 chapters, there was a test. And before each one of these quiz and tests, I would give them 2 practice quizzes drawn out of exactly the same test bank. So there was a lot of similarity between the real quiz or test and the practice test. The difference is that the first practice test required at least 70%, right? And I told them, you know what, you should get 90%, you should get 95%, be very, very comfortable with what you're doing. The second test was purely optional. Told them everything goes to extra credit. And a lot of people did, lots of practice test attempts, right? Sometimes they were able to pass the first try, and sometimes they passed many, it took them many times. The scores in the practice exams are positively correlated with real exam scores. So if you did really well in the practice test, you probably did well in the real test. And somewhat disappointingly, the number of attempts was negatively correlated with real exam scores. Why do I think that's disappointing? Because more than likely, a lot of these students when they weren't able to pass the first time, they just kept going at it, kept going on, without really going back to the videos, without going back to the reading, which is kind of a problem. That the whole idea was that they would do that, and obviously they were just kind of almost by luck of the draw, they were able to finally get to 70%. It would have been a lot better for them. And if this really were working, the more attempts you try, the more you'd be learning, because you're going back to the reading, going back to the test, go back to the reading, go back to the test. But this is all coming out of the same test bank, all coming out of the same test bank. The same. If the quiz was 30 minutes, the practice quiz was 30 minutes. The same number of questions, the same kinds of questions. The real test had the same. It was always the same one. So that all the students got the same quiz, all the students got the same test, but the practice quizzes were algorithmic. This gatekeeping function, the way that it worked, is that they were told, look, if you don't pass that check, if you don't pass that quiz, the practice quiz, you can't move on, right? And there would be some kicking and screaming. There would be some unhappiness before as they were trying. Normally there would be a lot of unhappiness at the beginning of the semester until they figured out how it works. It was fairly common at the beginning for quite a few students to show up to the first quiz saying, oh, but I haven't finished the practice quiz yet. Could you open it for me? I said, sorry, no, it doesn't work like that, right? So you're here, do the practice quiz, keep doing it until you pass it, right? And so I would sometimes allow them to come back to my office and do the real quiz later with a little bit of penalty. So I really built the class so that they had to follow my policies like this. Every once in a while, they wouldn't make it. They were not able to actually take the quiz on time. So they had to do with a penalty, or you know what, if then maybe just a 0, right? If by midnight you're not able to do it, then yeah, then you got a 0 on the quiz. Yeah. And then I would unlock the next module, which is, to some degree violating the philosophy here, but the time does keep moving. And in some cases that pushed the student to fail the class or to withdraw from the class. And again, I'll say one thing: if you're going to implement this, make sure that you're keeping the dean informed. Make sure that the dean knows exactly what you're doing and what the process is going to be. You know what, Mr. Dean, you're going to see a lot of withdrawals from my class because this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make sure that the students actually learn before they take the test. So my recommendation to you is just keep the chair and the deans informed of what you're doing, and I think that at least they ought to appreciate your effort and making sure that they actually learn. So summarizing, high quality instruction, when small check, then they had to do the reading, come to class, then there was a learning check, then there was practice quizzes, and advancement was blocked until they had performed up to a particular standard. So my hypothesis here, again, is that this system, it basically repeats what a good student already does, right? Study regularly, take care of, make sure that the check whether you're learning is going to be unnecessary for the top students. It's going to be beneficial for the students who don't really know how to study too well, but they want to do the work. And it's going to make the students who are not interested in really learning, not interested in acquiring good study habits, to drop the class early in the semester or withdraw, right? So I'll show you what happened. So raw results, I simply got the data and put it here where you can see that for those of you who are not familiar with this kind of diagram, in these boxes, the top line here is the maximum score in the class. The bottom line, obviously the minimum score. The middle line in these boxes is the median grade, the middle grade in the class. And these boxes give you the 75th percentile and the 25th percentile. So what you can see here is that the median grade was actually a little bit lower in my mastery classes compared to everybody else's, right? My median grade was a little bit lower, but there were quite a few more high grades in the mastery classes than in the other classes. Even though in the particular comparison is the 2019-2020 classes. This was kind of taught the regular way with homework and tests and whatnot, but none of this structure. And in this class, you can see more high grades, even though the median is lower. So obviously you have COVID in 2020. I'm going to control, when I draw my regressions and whatnot, I'm going to control for instructor. It is entirely possible that when I'm comparing these classes in 2020 against my class in 2020, when I'm comparing this, it may be that the composition of students is different, right? That the students have higher GPAs or lower GPAs, or they have more math or less math and so on. So I have to control for that. So what I do is that I control, and running statistical tests, I control for all these different things, for GPA, for what classes they've taken before, for the level of math that they've taken, are they a transfer student, how many classes they fail and have to repeat. I'm gonna control for the instructor, for year, for term, and are you double majoring in something, are you a math major, are you an actual economics major, all these different things. I do a Tobit regression, in case you care to know, and I have 181 students, and from fall of 18 to fall of 20, GPA, unsurprisingly, is the strongest predictor of how well you will do in this particular class. Also, having taken macroeconomics is as a predictor, and the dummy for the 2019 course had a lower average grade comparing everything else. So these are all the non-mastery courses, So if going back here, just look at all of these courses over here. What I'm doing here is I'm predicting grades here, and then I'm going to use that model to try to predict grades in 2020. Okay, so I use these predictions, this structure, this model, to try to see if you were one of my students, one of the 43 students that came into my mastery class, how do you think you're going to be doing? Okay, so these are this is the non-mastery course. If you're interested in this sort of thing, you can see here that GPA is the best predictor possible, and having taken macro is a weaker predictor. Okay, so dividing students into thirds, let me go back here, let me go down here and make it, dividing students into thirds. What do we find? If you were predicted to get an A- or better, just focus for a moment in the non-mastery course. I'll talk about the mastery courses in a second. Just focusing on the non-mastery courses. If you're predicted to get an A- or better, you probably got something like an A- or better, even though there was some deviation. Maybe that didn't go too well. But you know what? If you're predicted by this model to get something like an A- or better, you did not fail the class. You didn't even get a C, right? You were somewhere in the top range. If you're predicted to get in the Bs, again, you didn't fail the class. It could be anywhere from C to A, right? And if you're predicted to get a C+ or worse, some people ended up with an A because, they actually worked really hard, and some people, life happened. But the curious thing is, when we say life happens to everybody. Life really does happen to everybody. Accidents, illnesses, family problems, everybody has difficulties. The accidents and illnesses are kind of randomly distributed in the population, but the better students are able to handle those unforeseen events better than the not so good students, right? So what I'm trying to do is to help the bottom students particularly. What I find in my mastery classes is that if you're predicted by the model to get an A- or an A, I'm going to overstate my case. I'm going to say that this system guaranteed you an A. If you're a top student, if you're in the top third of students, the system guaranteed you an A. If you're in the middle third of students, there was a bit more variation compared to the non-mastery, but the average grade was much, much better. If you look at the median grade here for the B students was a 3, was a B. For B students in the mastery class was an A-, right? So this, if you're in the middle range of students, this system pushed your average grade from a B to an A-. And if you were in the lower third, it didn't really change the average all that much. But one really interesting thing that it does, and it's easier to see in this graph, and allow me to focus here over here, this is non-mastery students that were predicted to score C+ or worse. right? And you see a great deal of variation in non-mastery classes. You see an interesting pattern in the mastery class. You see kind of a splitting of the Red Sea here. You see a splitting of the students. The students that were predicted to score C+ or worse, C+, C-, D, F, students that were predicted to do, you know what, badly in general in the class, either failed the class, about 30% of them failed the class, and about 30% of them got Bs, right? And obviously there was some spread in the middle, but these were students that were predicted to go from C+ to somewhere in the D range. A third failed the class, a third got Bs, and a third were kind of in the middle. So the idea that this is going to be revelatory, right? Who really am I? Really, am I a Koester and Kramer? And does that actually work? Let me just skip this. Now, what I want to do here is to try to explain why is it that somebody would have overperformed the prediction. I predicted, looking at your GPA, looking at your math scores, looking at your previous performance in the university, I predict you're going to get a B+. You end up with an A-. Why was there something in the class that helped you overperform the prediction, right? Or you're predicted to get an A- and you ended up with a C-. What happened? And my question is, I mean, is there something about the class that make this possible? So generally, you might say, well, maybe what grades you got, right? What grades you got, whether you turned the material in on time, right? Maybe that has something to do, right? That kind of study habits, something like that. And maybe how much time you spent on it. So you might see it. There's some reasonability to this model here. What causes a student to perform better in this class than in this class with this complicated system of the checks and the videos and the readings and the practice quizzes and whatnot? What causes a student to do better in this class than you would have thought, given how they did in freshman year and sophomore year? Is it having just done better in the assignment, having spent more time on the class, or having turned things in earlier? So what I find is this. There is a high degree of multicollinearity, meaning that the information that I get out of the grades in reading, and the information that I get out of the grades in lecture, and the information that I get out of the grades in homework is about the same, right? Having all these different kind of assignment, if you were doing well in one, you probably were doing well in the other. Okay, so what I'm going to do when I run my regressions is I'm only going to include reading because I figure that that's a more valuable variable, right? What does it mean when I say that an assignment is late? I mean that you're getting penalties on the checks and the practice, right? You're going to get 0 on the readings. So this is going to push it, having turned in the checks and the practice late is going to imply that you're going to have to work a little bit harder and get a higher grade to overcome the penalty. The just entirely missing an assignment is not really possible in a way, because if you miss that check, you can't move forward, right? So what does it actually mean? It means that you ended up with fewer attempts, that you were doing fewer attempts compared to compared to what you could have done, right? So somebody who did a lot of attempts, somebody who did relatively few attempts, that's what that basically means. It turns out, and I also want to mention that when I say hours of activity, hours in time on task, this does not include the time spent on the videos or time spent on the reading, because those were outside of Canvas and I couldn't capture those. Okay, turns out that if you're a middling kind of student, if you're predicted to score a B, B+, B-, if you're in the middle range, then having done better in the reading was a huge predictor of how well you did in the class overall, right? If you're a middle student, the big difference for you was that you actually learned how to read a bit better. Let me put it like that, right? If you're a middle student, you probably already knew about turning things in on time. If you're a good student, if you're a middle student, you probably knew about I don't know, preparing for the test, but you didn't know necessarily how to prepare better, right? You weren't reading you were reading, but you were not reading very deeply. In this class, this particular system of perusal taught you to read better, right? And it turns out that late assignments, these middle students are generally good students, but they struggle with timeliness, okay? And this is what I find, that if these students did better on timeliness, they were predicted to do better. They ended up doing better. They ended up doing better. For the C or worse group, for the worst students in the class, is the practice test, right? They had never thought of checking their knowledge before. They never did, I don't know, flashcards. They never said to their roommate, hey, quiz me on this, right? And being made to be quizzed, about, being made to practice what they knew before they actually did it, right? Before, I don't know, they need to practice before you actually go to the game. This is a new idea. This is what made the big difference for them, right? And trying more often tended to also have a big effect. So if you're interested, and it turns out, kind of an interesting things, it turns out that time on task, simply spending more time on Canvas, doing things like checks or practice tests, simply spending more hours staring at the screen, was not particularly significant in any combination here, right? It's not simply that I squeezed more hours out of them, and that's why they did better. This is not what happened, right? It's not that the students that failed or withdrew from the class simply couldn't handle the amount of time involved. The amount of time is actually fairly reasonable. I really do think about half an hour or so a day during the semester. And that's not really what predicted doing well or doing poorly in the class. And if you want to check statistically what I just said, you see that I get a lot of significance out of reading and practice tests. More significance for reading in the middle group, more significance for a practice test in the low group. And then when I try to control for variables here, but percentage missing, percentage late, I'm basically just, in case you're statistically inclined and you want to see my actual results, and these results are what I just summarized a minute ago. The percentage of late was more important for the B students. The percentage of missing was more important for the C students. And hours of activity is essentially insignificant no matter how you cut it. And the number of pages that you saw that viewed in the LMS is not particularly significant no matter how you cut it. Out of just curiosity, I decided, well, what if I tried, if I tried this not just in the micro class that I put a lot of focus on, I tried this in the macro class as well. In the macro class, I didn't do perusal all that much. There were no videos, but there were checks. So I basically did a similar sort of thing, and just being mindful of the time here. So I had a whole lot of grades. I had, I forget how many, quite a few. 379, I had 379 observations. So I went and did the same thing. And I found that obviously GPA is the best predictor of scores, and quite possibly that their grade level and instructors is more or less important. And what I find is that if I divide the non-mastery classes in mastery classes, in this class that had the learning checks, you can see that the average grade improved quite a bit for the best students. It was basically unchanged for the middle students, and was a significant improvement for the lower range students. I had some failures among the low range students, and in this case was if I remember correctly, we had a concussion. That was the problem. It was a concussion. This was the COVID semester. This is the semester you're looking at right here called Mastery. This is the spring of 2020. This is the spring that got interrupted in the middle of the semester, right? And even with that, you see that in the COVID semester, you can see that the students that were predicted to do really well did even better. Students that were predicted to do really badly did a whole letter grade better on average, and much fewer failures or Ds with the mastery system. Okay, and this basically reiterates what I just said. So conclusion here. Many middling and weaker students improve their performance, right? We're talking about 2/3 of a letter grade, which is what you see in a lot of the educational psychology literature, that somebody does an improvement and the result is something like 2/3 of a letter grade. So this is, what you're seeing here is consistent with a lot of the changes people make. Is 2/3 is improving students' scores by 2/3 of letter grade enough to justify putting together all these videos and the checks and all of this work, right? Caveat, as a social scientist here, I have to say that the caveat is, of course, I'm talking about a relatively small sample, and I really couldn't compare directly 2020 against 2019 because there were only 27 observations in the 2019 course. So I had to go to a broader comparison. Something that I find perhaps more valuable than simply saying was 2/3 of a letter grade better, the fact that I taught you to work day in and day out, that you couldn't just cram everything in on the Friday before, on the Monday before the test. You had to every day put in a little bit of work, maybe taught the students something better, right? Moreover, and the fact that they were really, that all this information was sedimenting in their brain over a long period of time, over 4 months rather than in discrete little chunks, is, according to educational psychology literature, a better predictor of long-term learning rather than and that obviously I can't capture in just a single course's grades, but hopefully that's the case. And that's it. So thank you very much. What questions do you have for me?
All right, that was great, Professor Martinez. Appreciate we got a couple questions here. The first is, how do you test learnings for graphs in a system like this? Reading the graphs is one kind of learning, but being able to draw them is also important.
Being able to draw them, yes. In this particular system, using objective style questions, there's very little drawing, unfortunately. So that is the correct answer. Let me say a little bit more. I did have quite a few questions in which I would say, okay, tell me what goes on the vertical axis, what goes on the horizontal axis. Is the supply curve vertical, horizontal, downward sloping, or upward sloping? So they had to get fairly familiar with the graph, even though I was not testing them on taking a pencil and drawing a graph and making mistakes that way, which is very valuable. Quite a few questions, say when we're talking about graphing questions, and quite a few questions would actively encourage them. Okay, step number 1, draw the graph. Now, answer the question, right? And it would be difficult to get the question correctly if they had not actually done that. But yes, I was not actually seeing them draw the graph. This is true, even though I did everything that I could around that limitation.
Great. We did also get a request and wondering if you were going to be sharing the slides from today. I want to make sure that is something you are comfortable with before we go ahead and promise that to anybody.
Sure.
Yet.
Sure, I can do that.
Great. And did we have any other questions from the attendees? Feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A session. All right. Well, that looks like that's about it for now. So thank you, Professor Martinez. We really appreciate it. And thank everybody for attending today. If you all have any questions at all, please direct them to marketing@hawkslearning.com, and we'll make sure those get over to Professor Martinez. And we will also be emailing you a link to view the webinar on demand within the next week or so once it is edited and everything and ready for distribution. So I hope everybody enjoyed everything, and we hope you guys have a great rest of the day.
It was nice seeing you all.
Thank you again, Professor Martinez.
Take care.